In part 2 of this series, we're going to be trying to fit this big honkin' T4 turbo into this tiny little spot and doing everything else in order to make this turbo work. And to start with that, you'll already notice that I've already cut my original 4 into 2 into 1 header. It was not a cast iron manifold, it was just this little thin tubing here. I cut it just before the bend, and now I'm starting to make some pie cuts. That's little 30-degree pieces of just straight tubing. And then I weld them all together so that they go into one flange. And if you're going to be making your own header like I'm doing, what you want to do is keep your length of tubing the same length for each one of these 4 tubes. You don't want this length, let's say 4 inches longer than this one, and 2 inches longer than that one, and this one's 6 inches longer than the rest of them. If you do, it'll screw up your spool cycle. The air will start getting compressed inside there and start giving you back pressure, and that's going to screw up the whole point of trying to build boost. Yes, I know it looks like shit, I'll be the first one to tell you, but I've said it before and I'm going to say it once more. Function over fashion. It's a race car, okay? It's not going to be a show car. I don't pop my hood for nobody. Not now, not ever. So I don't give a shit what it looks like. And again, that sucker only cost about $10 to make. Hell, maybe actually $5. Now, considering that if you were going to buy one, say off of eBay or something, you're looking at a minimum of $85. By comparison, I just saved $80. And all those designs that I've seen on eBay can't do this one very simple little thing. And let's put the dipstick in. Something you actually need to be able to do on your engine. Something none of those headers are designed to do. Mine is $5 versus $85. Which would you rather pay for? And by saving that $85 plus, depending on which header you're going to go with, again, they range all the way up to $800. So all that money I just saved on the header, I can use that to buy something else in this project. So to start, I'm just going to make it a single turbo. I might add that second one later on, but for now, I'm just going to focus on the one. And in order to make room for the one, I have to take off the front bumper, which means I got to take off these 12mm bolts down here, which is underneath the headlight. I'm trying to do it without taking the headlights off because it's going to be a pain in the ass trying to put the headlights back in. Well, I got the front bumper off. A little bit of a trick here. It's got these 2 bolts. There's one here and one here for each one of the headlights, and then this one right here behind the headlight, which is a bitch to get to. But if you get all 3 of those out on both sides, you're able to take the headlight out, and then you're able to take the front bumper off. You're able to access these bolts here. So as you can see, I've gotten a lot done. Got the turbo installed, I got the exhaust going down, I've got my O2 sensor plugged into it, got the radiator in, I'm starting to run the charge pipe. I had to modify a lot of stuff. I really wish I had that turbo over just a little bit more, that way it wasn't right up against the radiator. I had to cut out this little section here so that this pipe can come over. The intercooler pipe's going to be sitting right there. And I had to cut out this section here so that the intercooler pipe can come up through there behind the radiator and come up to here. Now I've run into a little snag. I ran out of little silicone pieces and I need a 90 to complete this. So while waiting on parts to arrive, I'm going to start draining the oil pan so I can run the return line for the turbo. And again for mine, it's a 17mm. This is also a good opportunity to go back in after the break-in period and make sure all your connecting rods and all your other little bolts and everything else are all torqued. So I've cut the hole for the wastegate, and I'm going to mount that little piece of tubing there and then put the flange on it so that it'll sit up off of that. But as you can see, I've got a bunch of little pieces that fell down in there from when I drilled that out. Well, here's a little trick you can do. Get yourself a bunch of neodymium magnets But you don't want to stick them down into the hole, because what if they break off and they decide to stay stuck to the inside of the tubing? Well, you're probably never going to be able to fish in there and get them back out. So what you do is you stick it onto a piece of metal, the shorter the better, and then you stick the other end down in there. Then you don't have to worry about your magnets breaking off and getting lost down in there. And now when that flange gets here, I'll weld it on and it'll look something like that. Now ideally you want your wastegate to be in the center somewhere, pretty much at the connector where all 4 pipes go together, but 2 things. 1, I didn't have enough room for when I closed the hood, if it was sitting right there. And 2, I kept snapping my drill bits, so I couldn't drill it out in the center, I had to drill it out on the side. Oil pan's been tapped. Now remember, when you do that, you want to make sure that you mount this thing up high. Remember, this side is the bottom of the oil pan, and this side is the top side. All your fluid's going to be in this line. You want to make sure that you put this above that line. And you also want to make sure that you keep it away from your mounting holes. Otherwise, it's going to interfere when you try to bolt this thing back onto the engine. Now I got that little T-junction installed. And that oil line comes up and over and into the turbo. And I didn't think about this, but that little connector that I put in there for the return line is too close to this subframe coming across here. It looks like I had more space over here on to the left, but I've got my exhaust pipe coming down right here. So I could have had it over more, which might have kept it from interfering when I'm trying to put that pipe on, but what I'm going to do is cut into the subframe and then I should be able to mount that hose. Now I've also got a new ECU coming for this thing. It's P28. So when it gets here, before I go around trying to drive this thing and hook up the charge pipe and actually have pressure running through the system, I want to make sure with my cylinder leak down test and my compression test kits that everything is working right, that the piston rings are holding up, and that everything is all good inside the engine. So while I try to do that compression test, I'm going to come over here and disconnect each one of the injector plugs. And that's as simple as taking a flathead screwdriver, sticking it next to that little pin, pushing it over out of the way. Sometimes easier said than done. Now the reason I'm doing this is so that it doesn't spray fuel down into the cylinder while trying to do the compression test. You might be thinking, why don't you just unhook the fuse? Well, because I tried looking for the fuse and I couldn't find the damn thing. The subframe has been notched, the return oil line is in. Now, I don't have to worry about spraying oil all over the place when I do the compression test. All you gotta do is crank it over a few times. Not too bad, especially for a low compression piston. Now relieve the pressure, unscrew it, then the next one. Not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I know they can vary a little bit, but I mean, that was almost 30 psi difference. Of course, when I let the engine crank over 6 times, everything appears fine. Now I'm just wondering how to work this thing, obviously with it still in the package. I've never used it before. Well, shit. It's got one of these stupid connectors on here where it comes to a point. I've got the flat ones. Where's that crappy ass air file at? Where the hell is that thing? Now I just take this one off and put it on that one. Look at that, the air file finally turned out to be useful. As parts. Or did it? Damn it. This one's too big for that tiny little hole. And I've even got one here, but again, it's the same size as that other one. I need a small one. Well, so much for that. I'm going to assume that since my compression test went well, and I had the same numbers all across the board for all 4 pistons, that my rings are still good, so I guess we'll just move forward. Considering that it essentially has no muffler and it has this big old opening right here so that one of the cylinders is blowing straight out into the atmosphere, it actually wasn't that loud. But at least now when I get that flange, I'll be able to put the wastegate on there. One little issue that I had with this car when I first bought it was that as soon as it got to the 1500 to 1600 RPM range, that needle would just bounce back and forth and it would act like it was going on 2-step. And I couldn't figure out what the hell the issue was. I checked my O2 sensor, and that wasn't the issue. I made sure that all my other connections were good, and I couldn't find the issue. After talking to some friends that do a lot of work on Hondas, they suggested that my IACV might be the culprit. Now the IACV, also known as the idle air control valve, if you buy one of those repair manuals, like a Haynes repair manual or something from your local auto parts store, those refer to it as an EACV. Now I don't know what that stands for, but they're essentially referring to the same thing, but I don't know why that manual refers to it as an EACV, while eBay and people that work on these cars and everything else, when you do a part search, you have to actually look for an IACV. But I was able to wire it up because it didn't have a connector. I had to run it down here. If your vehicle is also missing that same connector, you want to run it down here to a blue wire and another wire right next to it, which is a black wire with a yellow stripe. And the black wire is going to be wired up to the one on the outside pin, and the blue wire is going to be wired up to the inside one. That's where this little red wire is at. So every time I'd be driving around without that hooked up, my needle would get up here to about 1500, just a little bit over, and it would just bounce back and forth, just up and down, up and down, up and down. And I'd have to push the gas harder, and it would want to jump up to 2500. It wouldn't go anywhere in this area. I couldn't just normally push the pedal and have the car respond smoothly. But now that I have the IACV hooked up properly, now it does want to work properly. So if you're having that issue, maybe that'll help. The electronic boost controller is hooked up. And so is the vacuum block, which is running from the intake to the brake booster. I've got my blow-off valve running to it, and I've got my electronic boost controller running to it. I also have my electronic boost controller solenoid over here, and those two lines are going to be running to the wastegate. And the turbo blanket is on to control the heat from destroying anything next to it. After examining the front bumper, it appears that there are 2 screws behind the turn signal that allow you to take the bumper on and off of the car, so that looks like it'd be an easier way. And that would be those 2 bolts down there. And with a little bit of modification, the bumper fit. And our first major snag is that the wastegate is sticking up too high and won't let the hood close. So I'm going to have to cut it and put it on there at an angle. And that all is going to have to take place tomorrow, because tomorrow night I'm planning on test racing this thing and seeing how it does without the turbo being hooked up. Now here's the kicker. The charge pipe is not connected right now. I'm just going to test it out and see how it does with my new ECU hooked up. And here are my ECUs. This is the stock P06 for the D16Z6 engine. And here is the new one I have, the P28, which is tuned only for a B series engine. So it has not been changed for the D16Z6. It's still tuned for a B series. Interestingly enough about that little fact though, is that it actually runs better with the B series tune than it does with the D series. So that's why I want to take this thing out tomorrow night. I want to see how that B series engine tune does by comparison to the D16 stock tune. Option number 2, at least just for tomorrow night, is to take the wastegate off entirely and just have that big opening right there. Because I'm not going to need the turbo anyway because the charge pipe isn't hooked up. Again, this is just to check and see what that ECU is capable of as it is currently. So I took this sucker out racing last night and I got one decent pass out of it, right up to the point that it grinded going into third gear, and then from there the transmission just completely shot itself. It's not a clutch issue, it's not a shift linkage issue, there's something seriously wrong inside the transmission. I only did a boost run, I didn't even reach 3 psi, so that obviously was not a factor. Obviously the transmission was just shot in the first place and needed to be replaced. Well, now I know. So that's going to be something that I'm going to be getting fixed for the next video. Wastegate will be getting hooked up and we're going to be racing and tuning.